On the 31st of July 1910, a police officer stepped aboard a ship in the St. Lawrence River and arrested a man who had believed, with good reason, that he had escaped. He had crossed an ocean, he was traveling under another name. He had changed his appearance, and the woman with him was dressed as a boy and introduced as his son. Nobody aboard the ship had recognized him. Nobody in Canada was looking for him. By every rule that had ever applied to a fugitive, he had got away. What he had not understood, what almost nobody in 1910 had yet understood, was that the ship he was standing on was no longer beyond reach. A wooden cabin on the boat deck held a spark transmitter, a receiver, and a young man who could tap out messages that crossed hundreds of miles of empty sea. The captain had used it. The message had reached England before the ship had reached Canada. And a detective had boarded a faster liner, overtaken him on the Atlantic, and was waiting. This is the story of Hawley Harvey Crippen, and it is usually told in one line: the first murderer caught by radio. That line is true, and it explains nothing. It does not tell you how the wireless actually worked, or why one captain out of hundreds happened to look twice at 2 passengers. It does not tell you what was found in the cellar, or why a jury needed only 27 minutes. And it does not tell you that in 2007, a laboratory in Michigan tested the remains that convicted him, and concluded they were not who everyone had assumed. Start with the man, because he was not what the story usually makes him. Hawley Harvey Crippen was born in Coldwater, Michigan, in 1862. He trained in medicine, genuinely trained, at the Hospital College in Cleveland, and later took a diploma in eye and ear medicine in New York. He was, by qualification, a doctor. What he was not in England was licensed to practice as one. That distinction mattered, and it shaped everything that came after. When Crippen moved to London, he could not legally treat patients, so he sold medicines instead. He worked for a patent medicine company called Munions, marketing remedies of the kind that filled newspaper columns in that era, preparations that promised to cure deafness, dyspepsia, catarrh, nervousness. He was good at it. He rose to manage the London office. He was a small man, 5'4", with protruding eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses and a sandy moustache. Everyone who dealt with him described the same quality. He was mild, unfailingly polite, soft-voiced, obliging. Colleagues liked him, neighbors found him pleasant. His employer trusted him with money. That mildness is not a colorful detail. It is the reason the case took so long to become a case at all. Now the marriage, because the marriage is the engine of everything. Crippen's first wife had died young. In 1894, in New York, he married a woman then calling herself Cora Turner. She had been born Kunigund Makamotski to a Polish father and a German mother in Brooklyn. She was 17 years younger than him. She was, by every account including the hostile ones, enormously alive, loud, warm, ambitious, physically striking, and entirely certain that she was destined for the stage. She took the professional name Belle Elmore. She trained as a singer. She had at best a modest voice, and her music hall career never rose above the lower rungs of the bill. But she was not a failure in the world she moved through. She became treasurer of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, a charitable organization of theatrical women. She was popular, she had friends who genuinely loved her, and those friends are the reason this story exists. By 1910, the Crippens had been in London for years, living at 39 Hilldrop Crescent, a terraced house in Holloway with a basement kitchen and a coal cellar beneath the front steps. The marriage had curdled. Belle spent money he did not have. She entertained lodgers, and the evidence suggests took at least one of them as a lover. He was mild and she was not, and the house had become a place where a small man was reliably diminished in front of other people. And Crippen had by then been involved for roughly 7 years with a typist named Ethel Leneve. Ethel Leneve was 27 in 1910. She had worked for Crippen since she was 17, first at Munions and then elsewhere. She was quiet where Belle was loud, deferential where Belle was demanding. The relationship had begun, on Crippen's own later account, around 1904. She is the second figure in every photograph of this case, and the hardest to read. Whether she knew what had happened, and when, is a question a jury would eventually answer, and the answer they gave has been argued over ever since. Now the night itself, because the timeline is unusually precise. On the 31st of January 1910, the Crippens hosted dinner at Eavesdrop Crescent. Their guests were Paul and Clara Martinety, a retired music hall couple and old friends of Belle's. They ate, they played whist. Paul Martinety was unwell and they left around 1 in the morning. Belle came to the door to see them out. Clara Martinety never saw her again, nobody did. What happened in that house after the front door closed is the only part of this story that has no witnesses and no record. Everything else is documented: receipts, letters, telegrams, ship's logs, laboratory notes. The central act is a blank. What is documented is what Crippen did next, and it is a catalogue of the small, practical, catastrophically incriminating decisions of a man improvising. On the 2nd of February, 2 days later, he pawned a diamond ring and earrings belonging to his wife for £80. On the 9th of February, he pawned more jewellery for a further £115. Together, that was roughly £200, several years' wages for a working man in 1910. On the 2nd of February, he also wrote 2 letters to the Music Hall Ladies' Guild, resigning Belle's position as treasurer. The letters said she had been called away to America urgently on family business. They were signed in her name, they were in his handwriting. And on the 21st of February, 3 weeks after the dinner party, Ethel Leneve appeared at the Music Hall Ladies' Guild ball wearing Belle Elmore's diamond brooch. That is the moment the case turned, and it turned because of who was in the room. Consider what Crippen was relying on. He had a story. Belle had gone to America, it was plausible. People did cross the Atlantic, they did have family emergencies. In a city of 6 million, a woman's absence could pass unremarked for a long time. What he had not accounted for was that Belle Elmore had a constituency. The Music Hall Ladies' Guild was not a vague social circle. It was a small, tight, intensely loyal organization of women who had known each other for years, who saw each other weekly, and who now had a treasurer who had vanished without a word of goodbye to any of them. They noticed the brooch. They noticed that the resignation letters did not sound like her. They noticed that when they asked Crippen for an address in America, he could not supply one. In March, Crippen told them Belle had fallen ill in California. On the 24th of March, he told them she had died there of pneumonia. He placed a death notice in the theatrical paper era. Now the questions became specific. Where had she died? Which town? Where was she buried? What was the name of the doctor? Crippen's answers were vague and mutually inconsistent. A place called Almeria, then a different account, a cremation, ashes being sent. The Guild's members began writing to America themselves. One of them was John Nash, a music hall performer, who with his wife Lil Hawthorne had been close to Belle for years. The Nashes traveled to New York in the spring of 1910 and made inquiries. They found no record of a death, no burial, no doctor, nothing. When they returned to London, they went to Scotland Yard. The officer who took the case was Chief Inspector Walter Dew, a career detective in his late 40s who had been present, as a young constable, during the Whitaker murders 22 years earlier. He was methodical and unexcitable, and the way he handled the first approach to Crippen tells you a great deal about how policing worked in 1910. On the 8th of July, Dew went to Eavesdrop Crescent. He did not arrest anyone, he did not have grounds to. He interviewed Crippen, and Crippen, faced with a police officer in his hallway, did the one thing that might actually have saved him. He told the truth, or something close enough to it to be devastatingly effective. He admitted that the story about America was a lie. He admitted Belle was not dead in California. He said she had left him, walked out to be with another man, a music hall performer named Bruce Miller, and gone to Chicago. He said he had invented the illness and the death because he was ashamed. He was a man whose wife had left him publicly, and he had preferred to be pitied as a widower than laughed at as a cuckold. It is a completely believable story. It accounts for the lies without requiring a crime. Dew found it plausible. Crippen then took Dew on a tour of the house, including the cellar. He offered to place advertisements in American newspapers appealing for Belle to come forward. He was, as ever, mild and helpful and entirely cooperative. Dew left, satisfied enough to move on to other work. And then Crippen ran. This is the single most important decision in the case, and it is the one that is hardest to explain. On the 9th of July, the day after Dew's visit, Crippen sent his assistant out to buy boys' clothing. He and Ethel Leneve left London. They crossed to the continent, made their way to Brussels, and spent several days in a hotel there under the name Robinson. Crippen shaved off his moustache and stopped wearing his glasses in public. Ethel had her hair cut short and dressed as a boy. On the 20th of July, they boarded the SS Montrose at Antwerp, bound for Quebec, as Mr. John Philo Robinson and his 16-year-old son. Dew, meanwhile, had gone back to Hildrop Crescent on the 11th of July for a routine follow-up and found the house empty and the birds gone. The mild, cooperative man had fled. That changed everything. Dew returned with a search party, and over the following days they went through the house 3 times. The first 2 searches found nothing. On the 13th of July, on the 3rd search, an officer probing the brick floor of the coal cellar found that some of the bricks were loose. Beneath them, wrapped in a pajama jacket and covered in quicklime, was a quantity of human remains. What was found in that cellar is central to everything that followed, including the argument that continues today, so it is worth being precise about it. There was no head, there were no limbs, there was no skeleton, not a single bone. There were no reproductive organs, which meant there was nothing to establish sex. What had been buried was a mass of flesh and organs, portions of the abdomen and chest, a section of skin, some viscera. It weighed a little over a stone. The quicklime, incidentally, had not done what Crippen presumably intended. Quicklime, calcium oxide, is often imagined as a destroyer of bodies. In fact, in the presence of moisture, it slakes into calcium hydroxide, which is strongly alkaline and tends to preserve soft tissue rather than consume it. The remains survived because of the lime, not in spite of it. The pathological work fell to a 33-year-old pathologist at St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington, named Bernard Spilsbury. Crippen's trial would be the case that made his national reputation, and Spilsbury would go on to dominate British forensic medicine for 3 decades. 2 findings mattered. The first was chemical. Analysis of the remains found hyoscine hydrobromide, a powerful sedative and depressant derived from plants of the nightshade family, present in a quantity consistent with a fatal dose. And on the 19th of January, 12 days before the dinner party, Hawley Harvey Crippen had walked into a chemist's shop in New Oxford Street and purchased 5 grains of hyoscine hydrobromide. He had signed the poisons register. The chemist remembered him. It was an unusual order. The shop had to obtain it specially. The choice of poison is itself revealing. Hyoscine, known today as scopolamine, is an alkaloid extracted from henbane and related nightshades. In 1910, it had a narrow medical use as a sedative, given in tiny doses to calm patients in asylums and occasionally in obstetrics. It was not a household substance. It was not something a person could acquire casually, and its effects are not those of a classic poison. It does not burn or convulse, it sedates, then paralyses, then stops the breathing. It was, in other words, precisely the poison that a man with a medical training and no license would know about, could plausibly order, and might imagine would look like a natural death. 5 grains is a very large quantity, enough for hundreds of therapeutic doses. Crippen told the court he had bought it for use in a homeopathic preparation, which is not a use it has. The purchase is the single hardest fact in the case, and it is the one the 2007 DNA findings do not touch. Whatever the tissue in the cellar turns out to be, a man bought a rare sedative 12 days before his wife was last seen alive, and then told a series of documented lies about where she had gone. The second finding was the one the defense fought hardest, and it was a piece of skin. Among the remains was a section of abdominal skin, roughly 6 inches by 7. Spilsbury identified a mark on it as an old surgical scar, consistent, he said, with an operation to remove an ovary. Belle Elmore had undergone exactly such an operation, and the scar's position matched. The defense argued the mark was merely a fold in the tissue. Spilsbury brought the specimen into court on a glass slide and invited the jury to look through a microscope. He pointed out the absence of hair follicles and sebaceous glands in the marked area, features that would be present in ordinary skin and absent in scar tissue. It was, in 1910, an extraordinarily modern piece of courtroom argument, not assertion but demonstration, handed to the jury to see for themselves. Now the sea and the machine that made this case famous. Wireless telegraphy in 1910 was 14 years old as a practical technology and had been at sea for about a decade. The Marconi company did not sell equipment to shipping lines, it leased it and supplied its own operators who remained Marconi employees. A liner like the Montrose carried a single operator working from a small deckhouse, transmitting Morse by spark, a system that literally generated radio waves by producing a controlled electrical spark across a gap, radiating a broad, noisy, untuned signal that could be heard across a wide slice of the spectrum. Range was unreliable and depended heavily on time of day. In daylight, a ship might work a shore station at 100 or 200 miles. At night, with the ionosphere reflecting signals back to Earth that could extend to several hundred, occasionally far more. Crucially, the technology was new enough that most people had no working intuition for it. A ship at sea had always been, in every previous century of human experience, genuinely unreachable. It left and it was gone, and it arrived and that was that. The idea that a vessel 300 miles out could hold a conversation with land was, for a man of Crippen's generation, a novelty he had read about rather than a fact he had internalized. Captain Henry George Kendall of the Montrose had internalized it. Kendall was an experienced master with a reputation for noticing things. Within a day or two of leaving Antwerp, 2 of his passengers had caught his attention. Mr. Robinson and his son were unusually affectionate with one another, holding hands, sitting close in a manner Kendall thought did not fit a father and a 16-year-old boy. He looked more carefully. The boy's trousers were split at the back and held with a safety pin. The boy's build, the way he ate, the way he moved, Kendall became convinced he was looking at a woman in men's clothes. He looked at the father. He noted the mark on the bridge of the nose where spectacles had habitually rested, and the shadow on the upper lip where a moustache had recently been shaved. He invited the Robinsons to dine at his table, and there he did something quietly clever. He told jokes and watched. Mr. Robinson laughed a fraction late, the reaction of a man who was not hearing his own name and who was watching others for cues. Kendall had a stack of English newspapers aboard. The Crippen story had broken in the London press before the Montrose sailed, complete with photographs of both wanted persons. On the 22nd of July 1910, Kendall went to the wireless cabin and had this message transmitted to Liverpool. Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Moustache taken off, growing beard, accomplice dressed as boy. Manner and build undoubtedly a girl. The Montrose was roughly 130 miles west of the Lizard when the message went out. It reached the Marconi station at Poldhu in Cornwall, and from there it went by telegraph to the Liverpool office of the Canadian Pacific Line, and from there to Scotland Yard. Walter Dew had his man's position and a piece of information the man did not have, that he had been seen. What Dew did next depended on a fact of naval architecture. The Montrose was a comfortable ship but not a fast one, making around 13 knots. The White Star liner Laurentic, sailing from Liverpool, could make better than 16. Dew boarded the Laurentic on the 23rd of July, traveling under the name Dewhurst. She left 3 days after the Montrose and overtook her in mid-Atlantic. Dew reached Father Point, near Rimouski in Quebec, the pilot station where ships took on a river pilot for the run-up the St. Lawrence before the Montrose arrived. And for the whole of that crossing, something happened that had never happened before in the history of crime, and which is the genuinely remarkable part of this story. The public followed it live. Kendall continued to send updates by wireless, the press picked them up. Newspapers in Britain and North America printed daily bulletins on the positions of the 2 ships, the distance closing between them, the behavior of the fugitives. Readers in London knew that Crippen was strolling the deck of the Montrose, reading a novel, entirely unaware. Crippen, in the middle of the Atlantic, knew nothing at all. It was the first time an audience had watched a manhunt in something close to real time. The technology that caught him was the same technology that turned his capture into mass entertainment, and both were happening for the first time. On the morning of the 31st of July, the Montrose approached Father Point, Dew boarded with the pilots dressed as one of them. He walked up to a small man on the deck and removed his cap. "Good morning, Dr. Crippen, I am Chief Inspector Dew." Crippen's reported reply was, "Good morning, Mr. Dew." Then a moment later, "I am not sorry, the anxiety has been too much." The trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 18th of October 1910 and lasted 4 days. The prosecution's case was the Hyoscine purchase, the scar, the lies, the pawned jewelry and the flight. The defense, led by Alfred Tobin, attacked the identification of the remains, arguing that without a head, without bones, without organs of sex, the Crown could not prove whose body it was, and that the remains might have been buried before the Crippens ever moved into the house in 1905. That last argument had a specific problem. The pajama jacket wrapping the remains carried a label reading Jones Brothers Holloway, and the fabric was traced to a supplier who had not delivered that pattern until 1908. Crippen gave evidence in his own defense and was, by all accounts, calm, courteous, and completely unconvincing. He maintained that Bell had left for America and that he had no idea what was in his cellar. The jury retired at 2:25 in the afternoon on the 22nd of October. They returned at 2:52, 27 minutes. Ethel Leneve was tried separately as an accessory after the fact 5 days later. Her counsel called no witnesses and she did not testify. The jury acquitted her in 20 minutes. She sailed for New York on the day Crippen was hanged and lived until 1967, dying at 84 in Croydon, having married and raised a family under another name. Crippen was hanged at Pentonville on the 23rd of November, 1910. He had asked that a photograph of Ethel Leneve be buried with him, and it was. Now the part that has unsettled the case for nearly 2 decades. In 2007, a team led by Professor David Foran, a forensic biologist at Michigan State University, obtained a microscope slide of the abdominal tissue that had been preserved from the trial exhibits. Foran's group extracted mitochondrial DNA from the sample and compared it with samples from 3 living matrilineal relatives of Belle Elmore, traced through her half-sisters. Mitochondrial DNA passes down the maternal line essentially unchanged, which makes it the standard tool for exactly this question. The sequences did not match. On Foran's analysis, the tissue in the cellar had not come from a maternal relative of Belle Elmore. The team went further. Using a test that examines chromosomal markers, they reported that the tissue carried a Y chromosome, that the remains were male. The findings were published and were immediately contested, and the objections are serious ones. The slide had been handled repeatedly across 97 years in conditions that predate any concept of contamination control. A specimen passed around a courtroom in 1910 is not a clean sample. The chain of custody, though documented, is a century long. Other scientists questioned the reliability of sex determination from such degraded material and whether the genealogical line traced to the living relatives was correct. An application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission to refer Crippen's conviction to the Court of Appeal was rejected in 2009 on the procedural ground that the applicant was not a person entitled to make it. So the case sits in an unresolved position. The Hyoscine purchase is documented, the lies are documented. The pawned jewelry, the forged letters, the flight in disguise are all documented. What is contested is whether the specific tissue produced in court belonged to the woman he was convicted of killing, and Belle Elmore, whoever the cellar contained, was never seen again by anyone, anywhere, in the 57 years that Ethel Leneve outlived the trial. It is worth pausing on the woman, because she is the person this story tends to lose. Belle Elmore is almost always described through Crippen's eyes, as an obstacle, a nag, a spendthrift, a woman whose noise justified a quiet man's desperation. That framing came from the defense, and it has stuck for a century. It is worth setting against what is actually documented. She was a working woman in an industry that offered women very little. She had come from nothing, an immigrant household in Brooklyn, and had built a life in London on a modest talent and an enormous appetite for effort. She held an elected office in a charitable organization, which meant her peers trusted her with their money. When she disappeared, it was not a husband or a relative who refused to let it go. It was a committee of music hall women who noticed that the story did not add up, who wrote letters across an ocean at their own expense, and who kept pushing after the police had been satisfied. The case exists because of them. Walter Dew closed his inquiry after Crippen's explanation. It was the Guild's persistence, and John and Lil Nash paying their own passage to New York, that put the machinery back in motion. Had Belle Elmore been a woman without friends, the story would have ended in July 1910 with a plausible tale about a marriage that failed. There is a version of this case in which the technology is the hero. It is not quite true. The wireless found him, the women found the crime. The man in the deck house deserves a moment too, because the operators were a particular kind of person. Marconi operators were young, technical, and slightly apart from the ships they sailed on. They were not employed by the shipping line but by the Marconi Company, which meant they answered to a different master and lived in a small cabin full of equipment nobody else aboard understood. Their job was largely commercial, passenger telegrams at extravagant rates, ship-to-shore business traffic, punctuated by long stretches of listening. The Montrose's operator was Llewellyn Jones. He sent Kendall's message and then, over the following days, handled the stream of press traffic that made the chase public. The equipment he worked with had no capacity for privacy. A spark transmitter broadcast in every direction, and any receiver in range could hear it. Newspapers understood this quickly, and the coverage of the Crippen chase was partly assembled by reporters listening to signals that were never addressed to them. That is worth sitting with. The first great manhunt conducted by radio was also the first mass eavesdropping story, and the two arrived together because they were the same fact about the technology. Kendall's own later life contains a coincidence so exact that it would be rejected in fiction. 4 years after he handed Crippen to Walter Dew at Father Point, Henry Kendall was master of the Empress of Ireland, a Canadian Pacific liner on the same Quebec run. In the early hours of the 29th of May 1914, in thick fog on the St. Lawrence, the Empress was struck amidships by a Norwegian collier, the Storstad. She sank in 14 minutes. Over 1,000 people died, a greater loss of life among passengers than the Titanic 2 years earlier, and a disaster that Britain barely remembers because war broke out 10 weeks later. Kendall survived. He was thrown from the bridge into the river and pulled from the water. The collision happened close to Father Point, the same pilot station, the same stretch of river where he had pointed out a small man on his deck and changed the history of policing. He commanded ships for years afterwards and lived until 1965, and he is remembered for the arrest rather than the sinking, which is its own kind of injustice. The other figures dispersed quietly. Walter Dew retired from the Metropolitan Police within weeks of the trial, at 47, and spent much of his retirement suing newspapers that misdescribed his part in the case. He wrote a memoir, ran a boarding house in Worthing, and died in 1947. Bernard Spilsbury became the most famous expert witness in Britain, appearing in case after case with an authority that juries found close to absolute, an authority that later generations of pathologists came to regard as a warning about how much weight one confident man's opinion should carry. 39 Hilldrop Crescent stood for another 30 years as a minor tourist curiosity, briefly rented by a music hall performer who charged visitors to see the cellar. It was destroyed by a German bomb in 1940. A block of flats stands on the site. What makes this case worth understanding is not the crime, which was ordinary, and not the pathology, which was sound for its era and is now argued over. It is the moment of transition it captures. For the whole of human history before 1910, distance had been a reliable form of safety. Put enough sea between yourself and a place, and you were beyond the reach of anyone in it. That was not a legal principle or a police failing, it was simply a fact about the physical world. Information traveled at the speed of the fastest ship, which meant a fugitive traveling on that ship could never be outrun by news of himself. Wireless broke that, and it broke it suddenly. Crippen boarded the Montrose operating on the old rule and did not know it had been repealed. He was not careless. By the standards he had grown up with, he had done everything correctly. New name, new appearance, no trail, a fast departure to a distant country. He was defeated by a technology whose implications had not yet become common sense, and by one captain who had thought about what the machine in his deckhouse actually meant. The pattern recurs. Every generation produces people who understand the rules of concealment as they were and not as they have become, who take precautions that would have been sufficient a decade earlier and are now merely quaint. The specific technology changes. The gap between what is possible and what people assume is possible does not. Crippen's mistake was not that he ran. It was that he ran to a place he believed was far away, aboard a ship that was already talking to the shore.